The situation in the Middle East has taken a massive turn in the last few days, and the response I'm seeing online is incredibly diverse and mixed, with people simultaneously dancing, celebrating, and dreading what's to come. But how did we reach this point? Is this truly the start of World War III? What do the US-Israeli attacks on Iran mean for the everyday Vancouverite? On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive, coordinated series of airstrikes across Iran. The primary objective was regime change and the total dismantling of Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile infrastructure. But was this action warranted? Is there evidence that Iran was indeed building these nuclear weapons? And how close were they to building their first bomb, if so? One thing everyone agrees on, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, is that Iran had become a nuclear threshold state. As of late February 2026, Iran had a stockpile of roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. To put that in perspective, power plants need about 3 to 5% and a nuclear bomb needs 90%. Jumping from 60% to 90% is a very small, quick technical step. The IAEA warned that if Iran decided to take that 60% stockpile into weapons-grade material, they could have enough for their first bomb in less than 2 weeks, and enough for 10 bombs shortly after. Since the 12-day war in June 2025, Iran had blocked IAEA inspectors from many key sites. The UN reported a loss of continuity of knowledge, meaning they knew Iran had the stuff, but they couldn't exactly see what they were doing with it in real time. This is where US, Israel, and the rest of the world disagreed. Having the ingredients for a cake doesn't mean you're currently baking one. President Trump and PM Netanyahu argued that Iran was covertly working on weaponization, the actual engineering required to put a nuclear warhead on a missile. On February 21st, 2026, US envoy Steve Witkoff claimed Iran was probably a week away from bomb-making material. Conversely, a US intelligence report from late 2025 and the IAEA's own statements in February 2026 found no evidence of an active Manhattan Project-style program to build a physical bomb. Also, most experts argued that while Iran was years away from a missile that could hit the US, potentially not until 2035, they already had the ability to hit Europe and Israel. Perhaps the most hopeless part of this reality is that Iran appeared to be offering to give it all up right before they were bombed. During the Geneva talks on February 26, 2026, just 48 hours before the strikes, Oman's mediator reported that Iran had made substantial concessions. 1. Irreversible dilution. Iran offered to irreversibly blend its existing stockpile of 60% enriched uranium down to a natural level. 2. Zero communication. They agreed to a zero accumulation policy, meaning that they would not stockpile any more enriched material in the future. 3. Full verification. Iran reportedly agreed to grant International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors full access to all facilities for verification, and even hinted at allowing American inspectors in at a later stage. 4. 1.5% enrichment cap. Tehran proposed capping all future enrichment at just 1.5%, which is well below the 3.55% needed even for standard civilian nuclear power. The US response to that was too little, too late, and that they couldn't trust the Iranian regime to actually follow through. President Trump stated that he was not thrilled with the talks, preferring a total dismantling of the infrastructure rather than just a pause. And of course, the most significant outcome of Operation Epic Fury was the death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader since 1989. Along with him, nearly 40 senior leaders, including the defense minister and the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, were killed. President Trump described the operation as the single greatest chance for the Iranian people to take back their country, painting a picture of a clean, heroic uprising. But there is a real irony here in the statement, because while the US and Israel targeted hardliners like Supreme Leader Khamenei and the IRGC command, the sheer scale of strikes hitting over 1,000 targets in 48 hours resulted in the deaths of people who were seen as the middle ground. Reports from early March 2026 suggest that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president, was killed in the strikes. While he was a controversial figure, he was a populist who had been increasingly critical of the supreme leader. Many saw him as a potential bridge, or a leader who could have led a nationalist, non-clerical movement. Also, by targeting the Defense Council and intelligence headquarters, the strikes killed hundreds of high-ranking technocrats, the people who actually know how to run the water, the electricity, and the banks. Without these representatives of the state, a huge power vacuum is created. And the most tragic accident being cited is the strike on a girls' school in Minab, which reportedly killed 165 students. These are the very patriots Trump called on to take over the government, killing the next generation of voters is a pretty disastrous way to save a country. The reason people are skeptical about a new Iran is because of the way the Iranian constitution is built. It's a fail-safe system. The concern is that the assembly of experts, the 88 clerics who choose the next supreme leader, are all hand-picked loyalists of an old regime. Even with Khamenei gone, the contenders for the spot are mostly hardliners. The son of the late leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, is a prime candidate. While the US hopes that the Iranian people will reject hereditary rule, he has deep ties to the IRGC and could easily seize the role to maintain order. Additionally, other figures like Ayatollah Mirbagheri are popular with the ultra-conservatives who believe Iran should have never negotiated. These leaders might be even more aggressive toward the West to prove that they aren't puppets of the US. If the clerics can't agree on a leader, the most likely outcome isn't a democracy, it's a military junta. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is more than just an army, it's a massive business conglomerate that owns airports, construction firms, and telecommunications. If they feel their empire is threatened by a democratic uprising, they are likely to step in and install a general as the new leader. This would basically be the same regime, just without the turbans. Trump's call for them to merge with patriots is seen by many as wishful thinking, as these soldiers have spent decades being indoctrinated to see the US as the great Satan. If you've been online, you may have seen a whole slew of videos of diasporic Iranians dancing and celebrating the killing of the Iranian leader. Remember, this is not necessarily celebrating the bombing itself, but more so celebrating the end of a regime that has spent its time using extreme violence to suppress its own people. To understand why so many Iranians are cheering the recent strikes, you have to look at 3 specific waves of state-sponsored terror that have occurred since 2022. The current era of Iranian resistance was ignited by the death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022. She was a 22-year-old woman arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab incorrectly. She died in custody after reports of a severe beating resulting in nationwide protests. And guess what? The regime responded to the protests by firing live ammunition and metal pellets into crowds. At least 551 protesters were killed, including 68 children. Human rights groups documented a horrific pattern of security forces deliberately aiming for the faces and eyes of protesters. Hundreds of young Iranians were left partially or fully blinded as a lesson to the public. While the world is distracted by other global conflicts, Iran entered a state of total economic collapse at the end of 2025. Inflation hit 42.2%, and the Iranian rial reached a record low of 1.45 million per US dollar. The people were starving. Starting on December 28, 2025, shopkeepers and merchants in Tehran's Grand Bazaar went on strike, sparking a movement that drew in millions. On January 8, 2026, the regime implemented a near total internet blackout. Under this digital darkness, security forces carried out a nationwide massacre to crush the dissent. While official numbers are suppressed, estimates of the deaths during this period range from 2,000 to as many as 40,000, with Time magazine citing hospital records suggesting 30,000 protest-related deaths. In the months leading up to the US strikes, the Iranian judiciary ramped up its use of the death penalty to record-breaking levels as a tool of political intimidation. At least 2,228 people were executed in 2025, a staggering increase compared to previous years. This included 64 women and 6 juvenile offenders. And in December 2024, a draconian new law came into force. It permits the death penalty for peaceful activism against compulsory veiling and uses AI-powered smart cameras to track and find women in public. By late February 2026, Human Rights Watch reported a tsunami of tens of thousands of arbitrary arrests, with detainees facing torture, enforced disappearances, and summary executions. So, as you can see, for many, this regime was basically just a hostage taker that had turned their home country into a prison. The fear, however, remains. If the transition isn't handled correctly, the violence might not end with its regime's leaders. This is where the mixed feelings come in. Critics argue that Iran was actually at the negotiating table just days before the bombs fell. On February 26, just 2 days before the military operation, the third round of indirect talks between the US and Iran concluded in Geneva. The Omani foreign minister, acting as the primary mediator, publicly announced that significant progress had been made and that a peace deal was within our reach. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi described these as the most serious and longest talks ever held with the US. Both sides had agreed to move to technical level meetings in Vienna the following week to finalize details. So if a deal was within reach, why did the US and Israel strike? The negotiating table was actually a site of deep internal division within the Trump administration. While US envoy Steve Witkoff was reportedly accepting the principle of symbolic enrichment, allowing Iran to keep some peaceful nuclear tech, President Trump veered sharply away from this path during his State of Union address on February 24. Trump instructed his team that the only acceptable deal was zero enrichment and the total removal of all nuclear material from Iranian soil, terms the Iranian leadership viewed as a total surrender of sovereignty. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio insisted that any deal must also dismantle Iran's ballistic missile program. Iran's supreme leader, however, had explicitly forbidden his negotiators from even discussing missiles, calling them Iran's only deterrents. The argument made by many anti-war critics is that the U.S. chose regime change over a diplomatic solution that was functionally complete. They argue that by bombing during active positive negotiations, the U.S. destroyed the credibility of any future moderate Iranian leaders who might want to negotiate with the West. However, the counter-argument from the administration was that Iran was simply stalling for time, while its scientists were 1 week away from bomb-making material. They believed that no matter what the diplomats said in Geneva, the hidden work was continuing. As Canadians, let's look at how this all affects us economically. Iran has reportedly closed the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point through which 20% of the world's oil flows. Oil prices jumped over 6% on Monday alone, hitting nearly $80 a barrel. Some analysts predict that it could touch $100 if the conflict lasts more than a month. In Vancouver, we have already seen some of the highest gas prices in North America. Expect a rapid increase at the pumps in the lower mainland, potentially hitting $2.10 or $2.20 per liter very quickly. Middle-income families in Vancouver are already struggling with the cost of living. Higher energy prices drive up the cost of everything: shipping, groceries, heating. This creates upward pressure on inflation. Because inflation is rising, the Bank of Canada is less likely to cut interest rates. If you have a variable mortgage or are looking to renew, this conflict might keep your monthly payments high for much longer than expected. While global wars sometimes drive safe haven money into real estate, the current sentiment in Canada is one of uncertainty. With job uncertainty caused by the US tariffs, and now a Middle East war, many Vancouverites are pausing their plans to buy or sell. The CMHC warns that if business sentiment worsens, Canada could slip into a mild recession in late 2026. Look, man, it's easy to feel powerless when the world feels like it's breaking, but there is a path through this. The Trump administration has claimed this operation could take 4 weeks or less. If the military phase is short, markets typically bounce back quickly as the fear factor subsides. In addition, assuming that the US's justification for striking first is right, the strikes have essentially obliterated a threat that would have eventually led to a nuclear-armed regime capable of blackmailing the global economy. In this scenario, the short-term pain of high gas prices is worth the long-term safety. Also, if the Iranian people do manage to form a more secular, West-friendly government, it could eventually lead to the lifting of decades of sanctions, which would actually lower global energy prices in the long run. On the other side, though, there is a chance that the US just bombed a country that was ready to disarm, potentially creating a failed state in the Middle East that will keep oil prices high, supply chains broken, and inflation sticky for years. So what now? For a Vancouver family, now is the time to stress test your budget. Assume gas and groceries will stay high for the next 3 to 6 months and hold off on major variable debt purchases until the fog of war clears. We do live in one of the most stable democracies on earth, and while global ripples reach our shores, our foundation remains strong. While you're browsing online, if and when you see someone on social media saying Iran definitely had 10 bombs or Iran was 100% peaceful, know that neither is 100% true. Just like with most things in life, I believe that the reality is not black or white, but rather gray. The reality was a threshold state that was using its nuclear progress as a bargaining chip for sanctions relief. Even though the bombs have fallen, the Sultan of Oman is still trying to keep a back channel open. If you see news that talks have resumed in Muscat, that is the #1 sign that the world is moving away from a wider war. In times of global chaos, the average Canadian can combat hopelessness by focusing on community resilience. Support local businesses that are struggling with rising shipping costs and keep your personal emergency fund liquid. History shows that massive military shocks like this often force a negotiated settlement, faster than slow, decades-long sanctions. We are in the middle of a very scary reset, but we are not in a vacuum. The world is watching, and the push for a ceasefire is already massive.